Hello and welcome to the third event of today. As this is a public event, I will start by introducing shortly Platypus, and then I will read the description of this panel and introduce briefly the speakers of this panel. So, the Platypus Affiliated Society, established in December 2006, organizes reading groups, public fora, research, and journalism focused on problems and tasks inherited from the old left, that is the 1920s to 30s, the new left, the 1960s to 70s, and the post-political left, the 1980s to 90s, for the possibilities of emancipatory politics today. You can learn more about our activities or find a chapter local to you by visiting our website, that is platypus1917.org, or by emailing platypusvirtual@gmail.com. And the activities in Chicago here that I was asked to mention, we have our reading group on Sundays at Harper 135 between 12 and 3. And the coffee break on Wednesdays at Hutchinson's Commons. That is between 4:30 and 5:30. All right, you can also find Platypus online on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Okay, so to this panel. Just a second. So this panel is about Platypus Broadcasting and Publishing. I'm going to read the panel description now. What is Platypus content in 2023? What does it mean to author an article, lead an interview for the PR, that is Platypus Review, or produce a segment for SPS, that is Shit Platypus Says, our podcast? Platypus Publishing, the Platypus Review, and Shit Platypus Says are three separate but related ventures in Platypus. This panel will include presentations on the formation, aims, and aspirations of these different forms of publication and how they relate to the larger structure of Platypus as an organization. Thanks, I think that's good now. Okay, so to the speakers. All three speakers are members of the Platypus Affiliated Society. I will introduce them in the order that they will speak. First is Pamela Nogales. She is a founding member of the Platypus Affiliated Society and founded the podcast Shit Platypus Says in 2017. Then we have Louis Sterrett. He is the current editor of the Platypus Review. He is the editor since 2021. And then we have Spencer Leonard. Spencer is a founding member of the Platypus Affiliated Society and, so to say, head of Platypus Publishing, which was established in 2014. All right, and you will have around 10 minutes of opening statements, which will be followed by the possibility to make responses, and then we will open a discussion for questions from the audience.
Okay, so the idea for a Platypus podcast came from a conversation with Anais at a Platypus convention party back in 2017. We started first with this concept for the show as the commentary on the commentary on the left, as a coffee break style conversation about contemporary politics and left responses to the present. It could also include commentary on culture. The original aim of the podcast was to serve as an advertisement for the organization, a kind of sample of our members at a coffee break or post-mortem discussion after a public forum. So this was in 2017, during the height of the Chapo Trap House, the arrival of Red Scare, and several other left podcast shows, including the now defunct Jacobin show. The idea behind the podcast was to highlight our process of thinking when we talk to each other about the existing confusion, that is to say, when we casually compare notes on our impressions of when the left speaks. While at its origins, we tried to keep tabs on capitalist politics and responses by the left, in the last year, the Shit Platypus Does segment, spearheaded by Lisa and Rebecca, has put greater emphasis on our members reflecting on platypus activity. That is, reflecting on a Fora series, articles in the PR, etc. Across the last year of episodes, we have featured 29 of our members, many of whom have taken up production duties, in some cases coming to us with an idea of the kind of content they want to create and executing it with our support. As Lisa noted in her report, for younger members, that is for newer members, preparations for a segment are like short mentorships on several rounds. One, they require that you deepen your understanding of the specific topic, and two, learn how to do Platypus specifically. You will learn how to guide a listener to how we hosted the conversation on the left, which means that you will learn how to do this for yourself. It's worthy of note that no one that Lisa and Rebecca approached has declined their invitations. Everyone was game. We think that the podcast is, and this is quoting from Andrea's part of the report, a tool to reflect on, introduce, and represent Platypus in a way that does not compete with or has to be categorically subsumed into the tripod, but adds to it. For example, it can help members return to previous engagements, like in the latest episode, episode 55, on the International Convention on Anti-Imperialism and the Left, which featured our German member Farsad returning to his Ukrainian War Panel initiative 1 year later. On air, he repeated Stefan Hein's comment, that the platypus activity often has a disorienting effect, which is why panels require time to digest or return to things later to understand what happened. On the same segment, Suni returned to our 2007 interview with Tariq Ali, bringing to bear a history of Platypus with members who joined much later. These archive segments have become a key part of our mission. We want to guide our members through the vast 17-year archive of our work and help them to make sense and learn from it. We think that intergenerational conversations like the one between Suni, Lisa, Rebecca, and Farsad, or between Lori, Jasper, Lisa, and Rebecca in episode 53, across different moments in Platypus represented by the membership, can provide much needed guidance and support as we bring in new members into the fold. Unlike the online left, which lives in the ever-present now, churning out content because they must, we want to give our activity a purpose and a direction, guided by making meaning from our history of engagements. We want to showcase that our organization is alive, not passively consuming content, but rather actively thinking through problems on the left and working on our education through our chapter activities. We want to lead, not follow, not tail behind the noise. While some of our new recruits may consume left symptomology online, there is nothing that replaces doing the footwork of meeting the left, live and in person. So episode 52 had interviews at the UC strike, as well as interviews at the End Fossil Occupy protests, and features the work of John Mette, along with Robert, Jasper, and Mark, in recording interviews from the UC protests, as well as Marius in Berlin, who along with Lisa and Andreas covered the cost of living protests. These are worth noting. These reflections after a protest or through interviews have been featured as far back as episode 9 with London's anti-Trump protest and episode 12 with Berlin's anti-AfD protests. Another avenue for meeting the left is the interview format, like the one of Boris Kargalitsky of episode 47 by Andreas, and our German member Sebastian Vogel on the Ukrainian war, so they both interviewed Boris. Following up with speakers after a panel or after an article for the Platypus Review can be fruitful to digest our work, thus adding to the tripod structure. It would also solidify our connections to leftists, which is always helpful when putting events together in your chapters. We want to help our members think, and while most of that thinking will happen off the podcast, in preparation for a segment, after listening, as you work through our archived links, in conversation with other members after hearing a segment, etc., we encourage all of our members to activate SPS as a tool in order to deepen your knowledge of our work in Platypus and of the left more broadly. So I'll leave with some ideas of what you can do. So for example, you can use a segment to do research in preparation for a panel or a teach-in, or digest what you've done, which we've done several times in different segments. You can also digest what you have done in your chapter with people outside of your chapter. A segment can also be a chance to connect with our international chapters. Curious about what's going on in Aarhus, in Vienna, in Leipzig, you can reach out to a member there and co-produce a segment, which would help to bring the non-English language content into the larger organizational conversation. I'll leave it there.
Hi everyone, my name is Louis Sterrett. The Platypus Review is a review of the activity of the Platypus Affiliated Society. In this way, the PR is an extension of that activity into print. The Platypus Review may have reporting in it, such as Michael McClellan's report on protests in New Zealand, but the PR is not a newspaper nor a news feed. The point of the PR is not to provide a venue for an immediate intervention into the activity of the dead left. We are not its advisors. During the riots of 2020, Chris Cutrone reminded us that Platypus is a place of quiet contemplation and reflection. There are overlapping timelines within the concerns of Platypus, and so the same is reflected in the PR. We are tracking history over months, years, decades, and centuries. Old ideas re-emerge in new ways. Fading echoes reverberate across the years. The Platypus Review is not like other organizations' publications. We take seriously those who take part in the conversation on the death of the left, even those who disagree with us. This leads to a situation in which the available material to read is not simply a display of our organization's line, which we don't have, as some might think upon first viewing the PR. For example, the various laments about our having published people that the left considers persona non grata. The best readers of the PR will be and should be members of Platypus, because the best way to read the PR is as a participant in the tripod activities of Platypus, which reciprocally inform each other. Reading and discussing texts prepares members to participate in panels and interviews, where they are able to push speakers to speak in a manner they would otherwise avoid. To repeat a phrase, we are trying to make our invited speakers sing their best song so that we can reflect upon how their voices crack. This organization is attempting to grasp the history of the present. The PR is a method of reflection on that activity. We've been receiving more submissions than was the case earlier in the history of the PR, which sometimes had trouble finding material. This is a good challenge to have, and a consequence of the substantial growth of the organization in the last decade. Through meeting with Tobias Rochlitz and Aaron Haggard, we curate issues based on the ongoing conversation of the OrgCom and the organization more broadly. Some members have been calling for more to be published in each issue, while others have called for less. We have tried to find some balance. The Platypus Review serves as an archive of our activity. With so many issues, the PR and the organization's history more generally may appear daunting. To this we say, jump in. For those with ears to hear, every issue of the PR rings with the death of the left. As Platypus members, when we discuss an issue of the PR, we don't need to be experts on the given topic in the issue, but we should be able to think about the symptomology on display. Why would an author emphasize that idea? Why would the interviewer ask that question? How do historical concerns appear? As Chris Cutrone writes in Symptomology, none of the problems raised in the history of preceding generations of the left have been successfully worked through. All continue to haunt us. Each issue is teachable, and so each is a tool. The only reason to become a member of Platypus is to teach. Just as one doesn't need to be an expert to read the PR, so too can newer members contribute to the Platypus Review. Like reading the PR, this is best done when mediated by our tripod activity. We have been trying to distribute archival issues among the new issues in order to get physical copies into the hands of members who might not have seen them before and in locations that Platypus hadn't yet reached. We are trying to provide you with valuable pedagogical tools and to show the connections that might not have been known before to newer members. Our present concerns have been conditioned by our past activity. Over the past year, we've printed panels from our last convention. We're about to print a panel from our East Coast Conference and from our expanded efforts in Australia and New Zealand, and more. We reprinted Karl Korsch's Quintessence of Marxism. We have published some great interviews this past year with people from all over the world. We printed reviews of books by Adolf Reed Jr., Vivek Chibber, and more. Several of the organization's teach-ins have been published on topics such as the SDS and the Green New Deal. Johannes Regel wrote a letter to Platypus in which he used the space as a means of reflection on his own activity on the left. This year's convention theme of history and class consciousness is appropriate, as such topics continually appeared over the last year. By the time of the convention, Spencer Leonard and I will have finalized the table of contents for Volume 2 of the Platypus Review Reader, which will be published this year. At the same time, a book of Chris Gutron's writings will be available from Sublation, and it will be an essential companion to Volume 2 of the Reader. I will be overseeing the editing of Volume 3. At our business meeting at the convention, we should address how we fund the PR. This past year, up until this month, we were able to print and ship the PR using funds from our collection of dues, along with the help of UChicago for printing an issue. As I noted at last year's convention, in response to a question from Patrick, we could not rely on dues alone if we were to continue for long. With rises in costs, our current practice of printing and shipping has become untenable without more funding from schools. See my treasurer's report in the distributed reports for more information. I've spoken with Erin Haggard about this, and she notes that we should be in a better position in terms of funding in the coming fall when academic school years begin. Thank you.
Unlike Pam and Lou, I don't have any prepared remarks. I'm just going to say a few things, and I think a lot will come out in the Q&A as well. Platypus Publishing is formally a limited liability corporation incorporated in the state of Virginia, where I live, and our task is to serve as the publishing arm of Platypus. What that means in practice is that we reprint the Platypus Review. And Pam spoke of the intergenerational conversation that takes place in the podcast, and of course this really models a wider intergenerational conversation within Platypus that no publication can substitute for. Lou just spoke of the echoes that ramify or come down through the pages of the PR. Every issue of the PR is taking up what is now a long history of engagements in Platypus. And in that sense, our present, especially because the Platypus Review is our form in print, and in that sense is our printed form of hosting the conversation on the left, like all of our forms of pursuing that strategy, they invoke the history of the left, and indeed they invoke the history of Platypus's engagements with the different constellations of history through the time of our existence. And in that respect, no publication that I can undertake can substitute for that. And that is facilitated by conversations with older members, to be sure. We are not, of course, engaging a living left, but a left that is in a kind of prolonged state of dying or being dead, being undead, and it remembers the past differently in different moments. Now, there's a considerable amount of asynchrony in that within the PR, in that some engagements feel more or less current than others. Others seem more or less perennial, and that presents certain problems to me when I edit the PR for publication. Now I want to talk about the projects that Platypus Publishing has undertaken and that it currently has in hand. And I'm a bit distressed that I didn't see copies of the PR Reader or Marxism in the Age of Trump outside, though I know that will be taken care of over the course of the convention. So I'm going to speak of some things that we've already published. For new members, you should get copies of those. Platypus Publishing has either published or in hand 4 projects. One is a 3-volume publication of the Platypus Review Reader, and that might be considered to anticipate a 4th volume. It's an ongoing process, and both volumes 2 and 3 are presently in hand. Lou and I, as he said, have been working on them together, and we've been working on volume 3 even as we work on volume 2. The other 2 books, of course, are already out. I would suggest or humbly submit that all members of Platypus should have all of these books. And I guess the emphasis there would be on Marxism, the Age of Trump, which is not going to be reproduced in volume 2 and 3. Right? So this is an integral part. It was published in a timely way to intersect a particular moment, though I think not altogether successfully. But certainly for our internal purposes of Platypus education, it is a part of the Platypus Review Reader broadly conceived. Now, what do we get? What do you get when you look at the Platypus Review Reader? You look at a lot of competing imperatives in the curation. There is an attempt to create a coherent volume that addresses a historical experience. What Platypus is doing in its activity is, among other things, well, really, as fundamentally, is we are organizing, as I think Chris once put it in a presidential report, organizing for the possibility of experiencing the present as history, as something that we can learn from. And we talk about that in Platypus by talking about phases of the left, for instance, and the different ways that we think about that history have been thematized in the OrgCom report for this year, written by Ephraim. So one thing that the PR readers do is they give you the arc of a certain curation of the left that is really the hidden transcripts of that history that we intersected. What do I mean by that? The left is continuously engaged in amnesia, historical oblivion, dishonesty about its own past, and isn't necessarily a very good guide to the history that it engages in. If you want to understand the way that the left was thinking and experiencing the burden of the past in the past, the Platypus Review is your guide to that, right? It is the archive, right, in that sense, and I'm curating that archive. And so one overarching impulse that you'll see me address in introductory or prefatory material to these volumes is what is that arc of history. It also serves the purpose of what can only be a kind of provisional sense of the best of the Platypus Review. I would definitely qualify that, right? Because there's what is timely actually changes with time, and I'm faced with all sorts of editorial decisions as to what to include and what to exclude, where ultimately, a criteria like that falls away. But nevertheless, there's something of that criteria involved, which will mean that, and it also can be the case that a lot of what we do in Platypus takes the form of engagements. For instance, with our pedagogy, there's going to be a section, for instance, in the new PR reader in Volume 2 that very much addresses the Frankfurt School. And it really does, those pieces are chosen because of the way that other writers outside of Platypus, or speakers on panels outside of Platypus, as well, of course, as, in this case, a Platypus speaker, Chris Catrone, in the Politics of Critical Theory panel conducted at a Euro conference some years ago, are all reinforcing, developing points that we develop in the reading group. And that's something what I might call like a perennial concern. So all of these considerations go into the making of these volumes. One of the, it is the house publisher for Platypus, right? That is what Platypus Publishing is. Here I think, the question of like marketing and publicity and sales to a wider market have always been a conundrum for Platypus Publishing. How suited is Platypus to host any kind of commercial publishing venture? And that's where we get into things like Chris's book, From Sublation, right, where we wanted a wider commercial market to address this publishing event, or to experience this publishing event. And it was some of the frustrations that we had around a kind of desire for that with Marxism, the Age of Trump, that really led us to think about the contemporary publishing environment, which is extremely difficult to navigate. It's where, certainly we've faced some of the worst of the kind of, hostility to Platypus. One of the great Platypus haters is Sebastian Budgen, who also dominates left publishing. And both Chris and I and anyone else who tries to publish, has to think about questions that I sometimes think young people don't necessarily think about that much, which is, not only do you have to write a book or produce a book, you have to get it published, right? Just like, in a manner that is analogous, not only if you want to be a teacher, do you have to master your subject, but you actually have to gain access to a classroom, all right? And that presents its own set of problems, its own set of gatekeepers, etc. And in large measure, we could describe the publishing environment as dominated by left as far as we're concerned, left publishing, academic publishing, and mass or trade publishing. And any one of those approaches to publishing, certainly Sublation as the choice of publisher for Chris's book, an academic publisher as the choice of publisher for my recently published 2 volumes of Marx. All of these have their own strengths and drawbacks. But I don't think that we could find any publisher for the PR readers. any commercial publisher would take that. It's difficult enough, as Chris experienced, to republish already published material. But that's the reason why I would describe Platypus Publishing as, in its essence, a project of republishing the Platypus Review.
All right, thank you very much. We will now, or you can respond to each other's
Open it up,
good,
yeah.
and we can go to Q&A. Is there someone who would volunteer to just grab the mic and run through the room so that everybody who wants to speak can?
It's a race.
Yeah.
Great, thanks. All right, so questions, please. Anyone?
Can I ask one?
Grab the mic.
Yeah.
Thank you. This was kind of alluded to by Spencer as well, but there's a question of like why to revisit the PR articles, and I think what this points to is that we're in danger of forgetting the PR articles and all the issues kind of that have been published at any point. So this kind of historical amnesia and kind of oblivion of the left weighs upon us, and I think Pam and Lou, the reason that you approach this question, I think, is attempting to re-clarify what the podcast, what the PR is about in the first place, is to offer newer members, also older members, kind of a regrounding. And I think the question that's behind this, and at least one of the reasons that I think that we're having this conversation, was the question of passive engagement, was the question of how these things are used at all. So meaning we have a recent phenomenon of people just listening to the podcast without necessarily talking about it within their chapter, which is maybe not a problem at all, meaning maybe it does get discussed in chapters and we just don't hear about it. So I think one of the things, Pam, this discussion, and Rebecca, Lisa, Andreas, we had this conversation, and it was hard for us to even respond to or get a sense of how people are using it. And I think that also applies to Lou, meaning, okay, how are people using PR? Is it getting used? Is it not? I think you've had some frustrations that the list discussion just sort of drops out, that it's unclear whether people are reading things. Another issue is whether people are reading leftists or whether they're only reading Platypus articles as a form of smartism or kind of this academic, I just want to agree with something. And so anyway, I don't have two specific questions. I just want to raise these issues and maybe get you guys to, now that we've sort of established, okay, what are we talking about? Vent your own kind of frustrations a little bit, and maybe the kind of background discussion to what you just laid out.
I mean, I would just say that I am probably the least frustrated with the podcast now, just because of how much engagement there has been from the membership. So I would just, I think that we're in a different place than we were a year ago. That said, something that Chris said in the last panel of like the issue of returning to the past, like how we return to the past and what past, is something that is on my mind when we do these archive segments, because in a sense, the archive dig needs to be prompted by the present. Like we need to have the present call on us to think about the past in Platypus, right? So it's not about just a kind of keeping like gatekeepers of all of Platypus's past that we're like pointing at, like new members just need to know, but also it's a way of making sense of how you encounter the left. And so if that's present in how people use the podcast, I think that's quite fruitful, and I think there's a lot of potential, and recently shown by Rebecca and Lisa's efforts, that people are not only willing to do that, but they take it really seriously. And like almost too seriously, that they're sort of paralyzed sometimes by it, and that we hope that we can get them to just try it out. So yeah, I'd leave it there.
Yeah, concerning the PR, yeah, it's not going to be helpful if you're only looking for Chris Gutron's articles in each issue. I understand the temptation. But the reason is, when Erica and I ship PRs to you in whatever city you're in, and you hand them out, someone's going to say, "Why did you publish this other person who's not in Platypus?" And right there, in a way, you need to be able to talk about it. Now, I'm not expecting you to be quizzed immediately upon receiving the PR, but you should be able to talk about why we would publish, I don't know, anyone who's not, why we would solicit an article, etc. Yeah, I'll leave it at that for now.
Yeah, I want to elaborate on that and something that Lou said in his report. Platypus doesn't take positions, right? How do you know that? Well, there are positions taken in issues of the PR, people read it, and they say that's your position, right? Why? Because to read the PR is, the only way to read the PR is historically, right? How do you know that Platypus doesn't take positions? Because we've published other things that take other positions in a body of engagement over long years, right? And when you solicit an article for the PR, which by the way is everyone's responsibility, you do that by pointing to other things that we've published, right? You introduce people to Platypus by asking them to respond to a panel or to a series of panels or to a body of engagements, right, which themselves carry a history. And so when we read the PR, maybe only Platypus members read it this way, not only that, because we do have readers that are far-flung and that have recognized this. You are being invited into what? Into the history of Platypus, which is arguably the only way that Platypus makes sense as an activity. Right? To make sense of Platypus as an activity is to think about its history, right? And particularly, Lou also spoke of conversations, debates spanning not only months, years, decades, but centuries. What would that? How could it possibly do that? It does that through its history and its engagement with the moment of the crisis of the New Left, right? Which we took to be the authorizing of the founding of Platypus, right? That there is this question of the intergenerational character of Platypus that, of course, was very explicit and manifest in the early phases of Platypus, right? That we were hosting the New Left, that we were hosting an older generation. We were looking at its reproduction into the present. Chris spoke to that in his comments today, that the millennial left, in a sense, liquidated itself and thereby ended up only merely reproducing the old left and the new left, and thereby, in a sense, liquidating itself as a political generation. So the history of Platypus opens into the history of the entire left, and indeed the history of, if you will, the modern revolution itself. So it's in that way that when we read the dialogue between our engagements with topics that are related or even repeated, right? That's why we actually repeat panels across history. Like, we're going to do the imperialism panel again. We're going to do the 3 R's panel again. We're going to do the politics of critical theory panel again under changed circumstances. Not just differently curated, but also in different circumstances, right? We're cluing younger members into this dialogue with the history of platypus and beyond to the history of the left, right? So in that way, right, the engagement with the PR, all I would say is that the PR readers are just a way to kind of bootstrap younger members into what is, after all, a very vast history of hosting the conversation on the left at this point. Oh, yeah, that's it.
Yeah, I might. Okay, there are other hands. Okay.
I give it to Laura. You can call people out.
No, go ahead, Laura.
Just very basic thoughts. I want to take advantage of the triangulation between these three activities of platypus. It is very tricky to have this conversation in a public event, and so I actually want to keep an element of an external consciousness to members, or sorry, non-members here, who I would also like to hear from, by the way. I think it's perhaps sometimes a mystery how the world perceives our activity. But I want to encourage non-members, but I think that precisely these three activities, we also have to think in terms of their internal and external roles, just to bring that obvious point to the table. And precisely in this moment in time, it's not only the internal and external, but also very much the fact that we have 350 members now from across the globe. It needs to be an international conversation. And on that note, I know Andreas is speaking or moderating, but we probably needed a representative of the German PR in this conversation as well. Just something to consider. And if there's a member of the PR in Germany that's here, that could be great to hear from as well. But I think the most critical conversation needed now is an intergenerational conversation as a product of the sixth phase. Sorry, that's obscure language for non-members. The period that we're in post the socialist turn. That's what we mean by that. So these three different objectifications of platypus activity basically are facilitating various internal and external dynamics. The podcast is a very different approach to the PR reader, precisely on the fact that it's trying to keep pace with the present and using the present as an immediate tool in which to pull from platypus activity, especially the history of our activity with the archive segment. And Platypus Publishing, naturally, because it's the book format, it's intended to really objectify the history of Platypus as an organization, primarily spoken to in these terms as an internal need, right? But also might require some external consideration in that regard as well. And the PR, of course, is kind of one of the important legs of the tripod in our forum in print, which is both a place in which engaging left symptomology concretely, but also responding to the present and history of the left. We have members writing, we have non-members writing, and the dynamics between that. Now, I guess a question from all of that, just a few points basically, but be curious to hear from you guys on the potentiality and looking forward about more triangulation between these branches, like how you guys are understanding the activity, how they can feed from each other in any productive way. Thinking more, I would like to now think more about that fruitfulness of the triangulation between these three branches of platypus activity.
Can I just say something before I forget, because I'm the old man here? Just quickly, I would say that the Platypus Review also represents a dynamic within the organization of Platypus, and this is most clearly expressed in a panel transcript. Right? How does a panel transcript occur? Right? The Platypus Review for members is to signal, but of course this has an outward-facing aspect as well, to signal to members what should you pay attention to among, in the activity of your comrades, right? Okay, there's a lot of events and there are a lot of recordings and a lot of things online, right? But what are the events and the activities that, as an organization, we want every member to be aware of. The ones whose transcript is published in the PR, right? And that goes for, that's a kind of a doubled question with respect to the German PR. Because the German PR is curating that amongst German activities, and then there's the question of what gets translated into the English language PR, right? And that active translation is really important. And of course, vice versa, to the extent that we have German members who aren't comfortable reading the English language PR, right? Could be translated back into German, right? So that's in a sense the peculiar place within Platypus that the PR, the role that it takes. So on the one hand, there might be a impulse from the ORCOM to say, hey, that event really should be transcribed. But that's a kind of a breakdown in Platypus. That's an expression of a breakdown in Platypus. Really, the impulse to transcribe events should come from those who put them on. Like, hey, this went really well, even, we think that the whole organization needs to pay attention to this, and the transcription should be undertaken by the chapter and organizers of the event, right? To call attention to the whole organization. So in practice, what there is a kind of dialogue within the organization about that, right? And it grows out naturally out of the fact that the ORCOM addresses panel descriptions before panels take place, and we discuss panels after. And so there might be some feedback to those chapters, like, hey, do you know how nice that worked out? I want to address, and so that's a kind of a clear statement about where Platypus fits in a tripod. And then I think, it's a wider question of how our tripod activities, how our outward-facing activities, our panels themselves, of course, have an outward-facing aspect and how they are perceived by the wider world. I wanted to take up this question of, and to ask Pam to address it, or perhaps even Andreas, this question of I wrote it down and yet I can't find it. Yes, that the podcast does not compete with the tripod. I think that's a strange way of putting it. There may be a kind of complex relationship to any one or another discrete activity that we are, so to speak, comfortable with describing in terms of the tripod. But in other words, it has fora-like aspect. It has a publishing-like aspect. There are interviews. There's also a kind of a staged reflection on activity, right? What about that panel that you guys just put on, etc. But I guess I think the conversation would benefit more, and I'll leave it to Pam to discuss the way in which the podcast, which is very obviously in its conception an outward-facing activity, right? It was conceived of as, hey, these kids listen to podcasts, right? Pam, mentioned Chapo Trap House and the Jackman podcast, and so how both she thinks about the podcast in relation to the tripod and the podcast as, because you also said, Pam, that you were happy with the way that the podcast is like being engaged by the membership, right? But how is the way it relates to the sort of wider left perhaps changed?
I mean, one direct answer is just that I think still the podcast serves as an advertisement, like just straightforwardly. I remember the way that we talked about it initially was how impressive it is to walk into, let's say, I don't know where Rosa is, but like to walk into a coffee break at the news school and to just have these, young kids talking about some questions of the death of the left in a sophisticated way because they've gone through the reading group. And that in itself is like a walking advertisement for what we do. You're not going to get the kind of education that we give you anywhere else. And so I thought, just put it on display, like show it. In part because it is mysterious how our activity is received, whether or not, recruits understand or potential recruits understand that we're doing teaching and learning. And so we wanted to zoom in on that. I guess the language about not competing with, which is, I was quoting Andreas, but we've talked about this at length, is that we're very conscious of not wanting to replace a leg of the tripod with our activity, but rather to use it to push our members to reflect on that activity or to prepare for it, right? So that you could prepare for a panel or a teach-in an assignment, and you can use it to gain confidence in your knowledge and the questions, and use it as a way of talking to, for example, SUNY about the anti-imperialism panel, and in that way you could just be better prepared to do the tripod. I think we get nervous about whether or not we would distract members, right, from our activity, which is why there was so much emphasis in my presentation about how it's an attempt to deepen your relationship to the activity that otherwise might have a superficial or mysterious character, right? Like, how do these kids just come up with these panels? How did these interviews just happen for the PR? And one last thing I'll say is that Lou and I have been, now that I'm in Chicago and Lou is in Chicago, we've been much closer in talking about featuring the Platypus Review on the podcast, which has forced me to read it more closely. Like I go and I sit with it and I take notes because I'm going to be responsible to Lou on the segment. He's going to ask me. And so we hope that it has that kind of effect, that it makes you more responsible, that ultimately, this is like old language from I don't know which phase, Lori, but that we want to push our members to take responsibility for the activity of Platypus. So that's what we hope can happen through doing something for the podcast.
Yeah, I would just add what Pam said in terms of the connection between the branches. I've appeared a few times now on the podcast, and we've discussed the kind of issue, the current issue, and maybe a couple of the preceding ones. I think that can
and
go
you
forward.
sponsor too, of course.
Oh yeah, of course. Yeah.
Just one sentence to the question of competition between the tripod and the podcast. I was talking to Ephraim during the European convention in Vienna, and I realized that I don't really know how the podcast fit into the tripod, and that kind of was worrisome because I consider the tripod so essential in making sense of Platypus and contributing in your chapter when you have the chance to all three legs of the activity. Without it, it really falls short and leads most of the times, I think, to a fetishization of the organization. But I think during the last year it became clearer that it does not, in that sense, compete with the tripod because it does add to it and advertise for it, which is interesting because one of our young contacts in Vienna, who now just recently became a member, once complained to me about the podcast, and she was like, this is, I don't really get what you guys are saying. You're using language I don't understand. You're talking about weird stuff that's happening in Canada or America. And so obviously she recognized that there's a difference between our podcast and other leftist podcasts. And I think that was important, and that also clarified that it really can only serve, given the format, given the fact that it stands outside of the tripod, in this advertising role. And I think this is very important. It is not to diminish the actual substance of the interviews, the stuff we're doing, of course, but in the end, it can only lead you to a chapter and to the tripod, I think. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense. So I have a stack. There's Jack, Ryan, Ephraim, and Victor. All right. Okay.
Hi, thanks guys. So I had two questions. The first was about contacts engaging with the PR and the potential difficulties and hangups that often come up where it feels like there's a lot of resistance there, at least in LA, where it becomes difficult for people to really feel how it's motivated or to understand it. I was just sort of wondering if that's a call on us as members to try to open up the history more broadly, or if that means that maybe we should be trying to host a different kind of conversation. And then the second question would be regarding the way in which we try to like excavate the archive, right? Like deal with older moments in Platypus. And I was just wondering if maybe there's some more profit in trying to deal with a more subterranean maybe excavation of like less well-known PR articles that might be beneficial to younger members to like deal with the history of our engagements that aren't just, you know, the death of the millennial left, for instance. That's it.
To answer your first question, yes, the members should be responsible for the activity of Platypus, and it's good to reiterate that you are the authors of the PR. I'm just the guy who like makes it look nice and like gives it back to you. Of course I make some decisions, etc., but this is the activity of the Platypus Affiliated Society. And then your second question on excavating the archive. Oh yeah, I'm sure there's a ton of lesser known articles that could be very fruitful. I've been trying, I don't want to overburden, when we send out the archival issues, I try to keep it to one or two, not to overburden it. But I agree, there's probably a lot of great stuff that hasn't been seen in a while.
Don't be afraid of using the editorial statement. It's in the back of every issue for a reason. Read it together if you need to. Sorry.
But the question is like, why would someone dig up that obscure article, right? And so, like, not for the sake of antiquarianism, right? Simply just excavate, but that it would have to be connected to making sense of something in the present. Even if that means that what that new member did, or maybe even veteran member did, was just they had a moment flash up, and they're like, oh, Tariq Ali, like, whatever happened to that interview, and then it gets, put back into the consciousness of the organization for us to digest. You should listen to that interview.
Yeah, I think it's tricky. I think it really gets to the vitality of Platypus as an organization. To what extent is there the kind of recruitment and mentorship that we are talking about when we say, intergenerational? Of course, we're not talking about like intergenerational millennial Gen X Zoomer, right? We're talking about people, generations of Platypus, right? People who were recruited to Platypus at different moments, and them bringing their experience to bear. There once was a time I remember giving being in Lou's shoes. I was the editor of the PR and standing up and giving some kind of statement about the PR report, about the PR. And I kind of had Nate standing beside me because he had self-recruited by reading all of the issues of the PR, right? And he was better at remembering, like, oh yeah, that was in 12, right, than I was. That is an impossible experience to reproduce now. There are, obviously the cult of the PR is perhaps best instantiated in the editors of the PR, Laurie, Sunit, Nate, David, Pam, Lou, myself, I'm not forgetting anyone. Aaron. But at this point, it really has to come from like living memory of members of Platypus, right? Who are who remember the impact that an article made on them. To give you some window into the making of Volume 2 of the PR Reader, I would say that the input of Ephraim and Aaron, who were recruited in the period being covered, was really important and actually supplemented the input that I've gotten from the editors of the PR at that time themselves. And so, that's the way that I think of, right? Otherwise, you just have like whatever it is, 155 PDFs that you can download from archive.org or something, or you could imagine people in a room, with Platypus reviews piled up on all sides or something, in some kind of Borgesian nightmare. But otherwise, it has to come through like the discussions of coffee breaks in chapters, etc. That's the organic way that it takes place.
Thanks a lot, everyone. I wanted to go back to the topic of soliciting articles. I think when we started recruiting soliciting articles in Melbourne, we'd sort of just email people saying like, hi, do you want to write for our periodical or write for our magazine? And people would say, I've been thinking about writing something about this sort of obscure thing, or they've already got an academic article they're already writing and they would consider us sort of thing. And over time our process of developing and thinking about soliciting someone has changed to more of a chapter-wide activity where we think about why would this person write a good article, what other previous PR articles could we send them. Maybe if we're lucky, they'll read 2 other PR articles and they'll think about maybe responding to them or even referencing them if we're lucky. We still only have about a 10 or 20% success rate in curation, in solicitation. So I wanted to maybe ask about how should we think about the task of soliciting articles? How do we use it as a chapter activity to further our engagement with the left? There's also like a very practical matter of like how you actually send the emails to them, what you put in there. Me and Kevin over the years have done various like good cop, bad cop routines, and have had various successes and some sort of underhanded naivete, like fake naivete in emails where like, I'm just a clueless Australian student who's read your article on so-and-so, would you, blah, blah, blah. So those kind of reflections, how do we think about making soliciting a chapter activity? And also the difference is soliciting for the podcast, because we've also done that, and we're always asking ourselves, would this person make a better podcast interview than a PR article? And we're always not exactly sure what to do, but we have some sort of loose idea in our heads which one we should do sometimes.
First about interview versus article, when you're thinking about this, something Spencer sometimes tells me is that interviews are articles that we couldn't get the person to actually write, so we just have to pull it out of them question by question. About thinking about who to ask for articles, I think it's a similar, not exactly the same, but similar to thinking about asking people to be on panels. And in a way, like it's like a stretched out panel over print, right? Yeah, I'll leave it at that. I mean, when it comes to what will we do for our specific chapter in soliciting an article, maybe your question is kind of like, will it translate? Like, I think so, right? The issues of the dead left are international issues, and so even Australia is a place of world history.
In Australia.
Sure. I just like an executive, just like a very direct response about how to solicit an article. Take it or leave it. But one of the things that I think is good to do when you write someone is to have it connect to something that you've attended to in person, or that I attended this event at this university on, Marxism and ecology, and several of the people that were there referenced your book, and it prompted us to revisit it. And so that, because I think that just throwing a dart and just saying like, I found your name online or something is less alive than saying like, you're being referenced by the left, which is why we're, like an authority in the room by the left. And so we want to know, what you have to say about it. In terms of like the PR and SPS, I think definitely always try to get a PR interview, if not an article. I think one of the most successful ways that we've used a moment where someone said no to an event, and then they ended up doing like an SPS interview with Boris Karbolitsky, who couldn't be part of the panel, but we didn't want to let the moment go, and it was timely, it was on the Ukrainian war, and so we thought, okay, well, we didn't get him on this panel, but we can get him on the podcast, which also helps solidify our relationship to someone that has been on several of the panels, and then gives our member Sebastian Vogel an opportunity to interview this left person and thus educate himself. But I think definitely the Platypus Review is the place where people should publish the interviews. And sometimes I think Emmanuel Rota, when you interviewed him afterwards, you said, well, what we really need from him is an article, right? Which helped you then prepare to solicit the article.
Yeah, I wanted to pick up on the idea of being naive, and I want to point out that we are very naive, right? Platypus doesn't really give you any expertise in anything, right? There are people out there who study things and they know things and they write books about things, and we kind of don't, right? For instance, Chris just carried our panel on the Debsian socialism. Chris is no expert in Debsian socialism, right? And he'd be the first to tell you. We know questions to ask and how to reflect upon why we're asking questions. What, so to speak, are the conditions of possibility of asking this question, right? But we don't know the answers to the questions, and just as we're in good faith when we're inviting people to be on our panels, I think it's a little bit harder for young people. Chris and I talk about this a lot, because you have teachers who actually don't have any expertise in anything, even though they're supposed to, right? And they just get up and opinionate and sound like anybody on the news or something, right? Rather than being real scholars or something in the classroom, right? But in the wider world, there's that kind of death of, so people are experts on a subject. If they're scholars, that could be, of course, leftist scholars or academic scholars. They're also experts on their experience, right? And we, it's a rookie mistake to think that you know something.
Just in the interest of time, I have Ephraim, Victor, Kevin, Christian, and David still in the room, and there are 2 questions on the Zoom chat that definitely need to be addressed, and we have about 30 minutes, so just to keep that in mind.
We have 8 minutes.
Wow, but I was told we can go 90 minutes because we have half an hour break and we started late. How's that? The next event starts at 5.
Who's in charge?
The organizational people.
We have some
You're
wiggle
supposed to
room.
say
Let's
that.
get to the question.
Okay, right. Let's not lose time with that. So I would like to take Ephraim and Victor next, then address the 2 Zoom questions, and then we have Kevin, Christian, and David.
Okay, thank you. A couple of points. One is just to underscore Laurie's point about the German PR, and people should read Tobias's report about that, which I think raised some important questions. But certainly translation is something that's important, and also in terms of our geographical expansion, we can get other things translated into English for the first time, right? Or, obviously there's the kind of controversial famous cases of introducing the anti-Deutsch into the English-speaking world in a certain way to denaturalize it, both for the Germans and for the English, and that kind of act of translation is also really really important. So it's not just like translate the panel or the Platypus members article. It's bring things that are rotting in their parochialism into the cold, harsh light of this like incredibly international publication, which both the German PR and the English PR are international publications. I also want to just comment on about the discussions I had with Spencer on the curation of the second volume of the PR Reader. Spencer brought the proposed kind of curation to our discussion, and I suggested a kind of a revision, basically. But really what it had just occurred to me of how difficult the thematic curation, right, and Spencer talked about this in terms of an arc, and having it's not, I was just asked what the PR Reader is, and I quickly said it's the greatest hits, but it's not the greatest hits. And there is some like specific curation, and I remember that when I came to Platypus, the first PR Reader volume was already out, and the theme seemed very much set in stone to me, because I obviously couldn't imagine how it could have been really any way otherwise. And what was kind of like an experience was to look at Spencer's list and have my own personal experience in Platypus kind of in there, not in there, do I recognize this, what's missing, what are these themes, does this really narrate the history, what even is a thematic conception trying to do, and I totally defer to Spencer's judgment on these matters, but I think everyone should think about that when they're looking at the PR Reader, because the issue's been raised of lesser known articles. Another way to get into that question is to really think about how it's like curated, and when the new issues come out, you should actively be thinking about that. My final point is about the podcast and really the PR as well, which is that we are in a different historical situation vis-a-vis the left than we were 5 years ago. And Platypus's mission of hosting the conversation on the left is something that seems to have become more difficult for various reasons, and we discuss that in various different ways. But one of the things that's happened is that the left has manifested, again, and this happens in different times for different reasons, its own hosting of the conversation. That happens in several different ways. One is podcasts like Sublation Media, This Is Revolution, right? They're very different from Chapo Trap House, which was like the clique having its say on every matter. These guys they have a bit of that, and maybe it's just not as entertaining and popular and whatever, but they invite people on. They think they're like inviting Platypus people on because they're going to like learn from them, that this is hosting the conversation. And there's also a phenomenon of leftists like holding panels. And part of how that's happened is that leftist organizations have dissolved, and what you have are individuals who are, as Spencer once put it very despairingly, everyone's a friend of the show, right? And it is, so I remember early on when the podcast launched, I had discussions with Pam about it, and my concern was, is this a kind of DSA boom phenomenon, and that the whole podcasting world is just going to disappear, or the left podcasting world is going to disappear with it. So I want you guys to reflect on the changed circumstances that we're in, and what does hosting the conversation on the left mean now, and when it looks like, Chris is being hosted everywhere else, and there are panels going on amongst other DSA factions, all that kind of stuff.
Just a quick note, we have to end in like 5 to 10 minutes tops, and there's still like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 people. So please keep yourself as short as possible, maybe. That's the best way to address this.
Okay, just quickly about the podcast phenomenon. I mean, one thing that has changed significantly for SPS, at least that's been marked in my report, was that We used to think about doing responses to capitalist politics by the left and then takes on that, right? Commentary on the commentary. And now the podcast is dominated heavily by Platypus members reflecting on our activities. And I think that that's a fundamental shift, and in part prompted by the absence of a certain lively civil society conversation by the left out in the world. I have been kvetching about how members think of these podcast appearances as if they were simply an extension of Platypus activity, which I don't think that they are. And I think that, there was a conversation with Mark recently on the Discord about what role that they fulfill, and something that Mark raised was, I feel like I'm getting some kind of education from these podcast interviews, these YouTube interviews, and they're just there. And my biggest concern with that is that it produces a kind of passive membership, because in a similar way, which I know this is sort of inside baseball talk, but in a similar way that maybe some of the pedagogues' calls have become sort of a passive consumption of pedagogues' call, right? It's another podcast, it's something that you put on and you listen to. And so that we really need to be careful, because ultimately what we want to do is activate and return to our actual activity. But it's more difficult, so I'm not suggesting that we can just jump over the difficulty, but there's something about returning to our own activity in a curated way, prompted by both veteran members and new experiences on the left, which I think we should pay attention to, rather than assuming that we know what that looks like.
I wasn't the editor for the same 5-year span the way Pam's been overlooking the podcast. I guess I would ask, the OrdCon, who's been around since then. Yeah, I don't know. Podcasts are definitely not a substitute for learning, a substitute for trying to make your eyes move over text and then make sense of it in your head. There really is something to being confused and being frustrated. I'll leave it at that for now.
I'll just take that as a comment.
Thanks. I had a question that would take too long to answer, but I'll just raise it so that people can think about that later on, which is to historicize the PR in the much broader context. The PR is not the Rheinische Zeitung, it's not the sort of paper that Rosa Luxemburg would have edited, it's not Pravda, it's also not The Militant, and it's also not the New Left Review, and there's reasons for this, and I think it's understanding why that is a good way of understanding Platypus and the other way around. I say this both for Platypus members and for people who aren't members and who are in the room. And I just wanted to add something on what was just said, which is that about the transcription of panels. That transcribing a panel is not just about having a paper version of the panel, that it's really thinking about the panel and synthesizing it, and so this is why with this over the past few years, because technology makes it possible to automatically transcribe panels, I think a lot of people have wanted to use that as an easy way out, or have raised the question of why we don't do that. And we could also translate things much more easily that way. We don't do it because transcribing is not about transcribing, it's about synthesizing and thinking through a panel and making it available in a new form. Reading a panel is very different from listening to a panel, and it's very different from seeing the panel live. And so I just wanted to emphasize this as a very important way, and to encourage people to transcribe panels for that reason. Thank you.
Thank you. Do you guys want to respond immediately? Because otherwise, I still would like to get Tobias's question out of the chat. Tobias Oflitz, who is the editor of the German PR.
Okay,
so Tamás is
I'll
going
read
to
that.
read out the question asked in the Zoom chat.
Tobias says, "Hi everyone. Since the German language PR was addressed, I would like to comment on it. Unfortunately, I can't be in Chicago this year. The main question I want to raise is, what does it mean for the whole Platypus membership to reflect on the German language PR? And by extension, does the non-German speaking membership even need to reflect on it? This touches on the question of the relationship between German-speaking Platypus and the whole organization that was addressed in some reports that hopefully will be discussed further in the next days."
I think Lisa, if I can just maybe repeat Lisa's point. Lisa wrote in her report that one of the ways that segments can be used is by having those members who do read German come to discuss this on the Platypus on the podcast, and I think that that's a really good tool to use. And I think that it's also important. I would say yes, Tobias. It's very important for us to know like what the activity of the German PR is. I think that we would be poorer without it.
Yeah, and I would just note, speaking of, that we had just in the past year or two translated works translated by Thomas Vladi and Leonie Ettinger from the German PR into English.
I was just going to address Victor's question. I think the question of the German PR is quite practical, right? What we should be thinking about is, right, why don't we have a Portuguese PR? And why don't we have a French PR? And why don't we have a Chinese PR? And all of the frustrations that would produce, right? And all the needs for translations that would produce, right? That, I think that, there's a practical question of, do we have the capacity organizationally to adequately represent the German PR in translation? Beyond that, I think that we rely on reports from our German comrades about their activity on the list. And that includes, both the panels that they put on, as well as the discussion of their articles. But I think that what would prompt translation is the desire of our German members to discuss their activity on the basis of a transcript or an objectification of that activity, right? That's what's signaling to us the need to have an organizational capacity to undertake those translations to overcome what is, after all, just the blunt fact of the language barrier. I think, just to highlight what Victor said, and just to restate old things that we all know, right? Our transcripts are edited transcripts. They used to be quite short, and that made them better in a lot of ways, because what the editing did was it picked out the essence of the conversation. Right? It picked out the essence of the recognition of the death of the left in the conversation, the void at the center of the conversation, right? And as it were, constellated, identified it, right? Which might also, the exercise that I would encourage young people to engage in is to read the transcript and then listen to the event. Right, as a way of, these are not things, and this is, I think, it's the issue of passive consumption, right? How do we reflect upon our activity, right? There's a use of a transcript. I highlighted the practical use, which is that we highlight the activity of some chapters to the rest of the organization through transcription. But why does the chapter itself transcribe it? To facilitate their ongoing reflection. Right, an event doesn't take place and then it's over. Right, the event is there to reflect upon, to raise in your reading groups, to discuss again in light of other engagements in the future. Right, it forms a part of a conversation with fellow comrades in your chapters, etc., that you come back to and think about differently. Right, and that's why we publish edited transcripts made by human beings and not machine transcripts for I don't know what people who don't understand others with accents.
All right. I've been informed, unfortunately, that we have to cut it at this point, but I want to strongly encourage everyone who couldn't ask a question now to carry their questions over into the internal business meeting. I think there will be enough possibility to ask these questions. And I think, Ryan, you have...
So we're starting again at 5 sharp, so go out, have a cigarette, or walk outside for a few minutes, but be back in your seats. Where are we?